Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I would like to start by thanking Istvan for inviting me and for creating this modern virtual majlis of scholars. The ability of holding this kind of a majlis was inconceivable only a few years ago. I also like very much the format of the majlis, asking presenters to start by talking a bit about their biography and intellectual journey. It can be fascinating and rewarding to learn about people's trajectories, both the deliberate decision they take in life and the indeliberate ones. So let me start my presentation by talking about how I got to do what I do. So I grew up in Haifa in Israel. Haifa is a city in the north of the country and is what we call the mixed city, meaning a city in which both Jewish and Palestinian Israelis live together. It stands out among other mixed cities in Israel in that it doesn't have much of the tensions that often characterize the other mixed cities in Israel, like Jerusalem or Lod, Lid, and others. At the same time, growing up in Haifa, I did not experience as much integration in the society around me. The school system was separated into schools in Arabic and schools in Hebrew, and so were the neighborhoods. Still, growing in a place with a diverse population impacted me, and as a teenager, I became interested in the question of whether Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, whether citizens of the state or those living under occupation, if they can have a shared future, and if so, how. This interest took shape for me both in some political activism that I was involved during these years and in a strong interest I took in the history of the Middle East. Another thread of interest that had an influence on what I do today was my engagement with music. I studied violin from an early age and spent a lot of time making music, practicing, of course, playing in an orchestra, and later playing chamber music. Growing up, I was exposed primarily to classical Western music. Arab music was around me, but not really part of my life, and was even looked down upon by people around me. Maybe I can tell a short story that would illustrate that. Um, when I played in Haifa's youth symphony, of which I have otherwise wonderful memories, one of our conductors used to tell us when we played out of tune that we sound like the orchestra of Zuzu Musa. At the time, I had no idea who Zuzu Musa was, and neither my fellow players. We giggled and understood that it meant that we really played bad. It was only years later that I realized who Zuzu Musa was. He was a Jewish Egyptian violinist who played in Muhammad Abdel Wahhab's legendary orchestra. He immigrated to Israel after the 67 war and was appointed as the director of the Arab Orchestra of Israel, of the Israeli radio, an orchestra that was comprised of other star musicians, all immigrants from Arab countries. Anyway, I think what I'm trying to say here is that my journey started in my teen years, discovering the complexity and the diversity of the society I was part of, a complexity that created many tensions, but also enriched the society and sparked my interest and curiosity. Before college, I had opportunities to spend 1 year in this, studying Arabic in this unique institution called Givat Haviva. We spent there a year living in a boarding school settings in a very remote location, studying for 8 hours a day. And then afterwards, I went to college and I spent my college years in Tel Aviv University. I began as a double major in the history of the Middle East and Arabic literature. My initial intention was to become a historian of the modern Middle East, but I soon changed my focus. Although I liked my contemporary history classes, I was fascinated by classes in the Arabic department. I got to study with people like Yossi Sadan, with the late Uri Rubin and Rina Drori, and other fine scholars who really fascinated me with their knowledge of and passion for the field. So very early on, I decided that I want to be a medievalist and never looked back, or maybe once or twice. Um, After finishing my BA, I remained in Tel Aviv University for a while, for 4 years actually, and taught a little bit in the Department of Arabic and in Middle Eastern history. I also worked on a research in Hadith that I actually never published on the Masih ad-Dajjal. Um, I eventually decided to continue my studies in the US and ended up doing my PhD at Harvard, where I spent the next 9 years of my life. The American graduate experience allowed me to continue pursuing some of my interests, but also explore the broad field in a new way. In my first semester at grad school, I remember that my first advisor, Bill Graham, looked at my suggested course list and saw that I wanted to take a hadith course with him. And he said to me, "That's fine with me, but I know that you studied a lot of hadith before." So he said, he was wondering, why won't I try something new? And I took his suggestion seriously and went on a small exploration that kind of took me to anthropology, music, literature, philosophy. And these years, I got a chance to study with great scholars that I really looked up to, like Wolfhard Heinrichs, who became my dissertation advisor, Wheeler Thaxton, and others, of course. I want to say something about this exploration in graduate school. I think it was very meaningful for me, but was definitely not a linear progression, as it may seem when talking about one's biography like that. In the process, you end up trying all kind of things. Some of them you find useful, some of them not. Sometimes I was productive, sometimes or many times I wasn't. Um, at the end of this exploration, I think I also realized that I'm much more a philologist than I originally was willing to admit. Um, my department at Harvard, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, was an old school institution of learning for good and bad. The idea of rushing graduate students to finish their dissertation in a small number of years seems alien to many of my professors. We were all in a journey في طلب العلم, and setting practical deadlines sometimes seems like a modern bid'ah for how education should look like. My exploration into musicological study of the pre-modern Arab world led me also to take some interest in contemporary Arab music. I went to a few summer courses, camps of this place called the Arabic Music Retreat, here in the US actually, where I had a chance to study with some of the leading musicians of contemporary Arab music, like Simon Shaheen, Bassam Saba, Ali Jihad Rasi, and Sharb al-Rawhana. I studied Arab violin with the late Bassam Saba, and then went on to study oud with him. And later on, I also studied with another musician, Taysir Elias. In my dissertation, I found a way to combine my interest in music and my broader interest in pre-modern Arabic literature, and I ended up writing about the discourse of musical instruments in Arabic poetry and philosophy. Something else that happened to me in grad school that I think shaped my career was that in order to maintain my scholarship, I had to teach. And I started by being a TA in Arabic courses. And eventually I was asked to teach MSA courses as a graduate instructor. And I think this experience of teaching, I found out two things. First, that I enjoy teaching very much. Second, that I love the interaction with the language in my teaching, and I love the mechanics of the language, something that some will call grammar, and this unmediated access to the aesthetic of the language. But by the time that I got to the job market, I already had like 6 years of teaching Arabic, and I realized that in addition to being Arabist or Arabic literature person, I also became an Arabic language person. And I believe this helped me very much in the next stage of my career, finding a job after graduate school. Which bring me to the point that when I eventually graduated after 9 years, I got a job at Carleton College, which is a liberal arts college, and a place where I've been teaching in the last 15 years. For those of you outside the US who might not be familiar with the range of American academia, liberal arts colleges are institutions that focus on undergraduate education. They are often private university with selective admissions that offer students the opportunity to study in smaller classes across the curriculum. Teaching in a liberal arts college had its pros and cons for me. I've had the opportunity to teach many excellent students who are interested in this kind of broad education, and I got to work with wonderful colleagues. It also meant that my position required that I dedicate much more time to teaching than to research, something that I didn't anticipate I would do when I was in graduate school. And in terms of teaching, I teach great students, but I don't have graduate students. Teaching at Carleton also allowed me to combine my eclectic interest. I teach Arabic language courses in all levels. I teach classes in translation, Arab music and literature, and I also get to do some hands-on music. I teach oud and occasionally direct some music ensembles in the college. Before I proceed to talk and talk with you about my current project, Istvan asked me yesterday if I would want to play something short on the oud as a transition. Beyond the fact that Istvan is the patron of the Majlis, and therefore his wish is my command, I agree that it would be nice transition, though totally unrelated to my talk. So please bear with me for a few minutes. Maybe I'll do a very short interlude on the oud. I just need to get sitting for a second. I hope you heard anything, something.
We did.
And
we
now,
did. We did. Thank you very much, Yaron.
wonderful, thank you.
That makes it a real proper full majlis with music in it. Thank you.
Fantastic. So as a patron, I expect the reward at the end of the Majlis. Yeah. So now to something completely different. Let me talk about my recent project on the poetry of the 1001 Nights. So The Nights is one of the most important literary works in Arabic, although it did not receive a lot of attention or acclaim in the pre-modern world. This changed dramatically after Antoine Galland published his elaborated translation of the work into French at the beginning of the 18th century. Both scholars and the general public in Europe and in the Middle East were fascinated by this work, and it has persistently received attention by wide audiences, including scholars. This attention was well deserved, I think, and the rich scholarship that we have on this unusual work continues to produce fascinating new studies. An aspect of the work that until now has received less scholarly attention is the poetry in the Nights and its place within the collection. The Nights is perceived often as a work of prose containing the narrated stories that Shahrazad recounted to the king Shahrayar in order to postpone his disposal of her, as he did for his other wives. Though the text is primarily in prose, it contains a great number of poems interspersed throughout the stories. Some stories have more poems, other less. Some manuscripts contain more poems, other less. But poetry is always there and a part of the narrative. This makes the work, as Heinrichs has argued convincingly, a prosymmetric work, a work in which prose and poetry interact. Before I begin talking about my own thoughts about the place of the poetry of the night, I want to mention a few studies who looked at this work before me. I won't go into a detailed survey of the scholarship of the topic, but a few things I think should be mentioned. Although the early studies of the Nights did not ignore the existence of poetry in the collection, they tended to download its importance. The first study dedicated to the poetry of the Nights was written by Josef Horowitz in 1915, and Horowitz, working on the expanded second Calcutta edition, counted 1,420 appearances of poetry when subtracting reoccurrence of poems amounted to 1,250 different poems. Horowitz even managed to identify a fourth of these poems in other collections. A general agreement among scholars of the early generation, as well as some after, was that the poems of the Nights are not its strongest feature. Littmann, who translated the Nights into German and who also wrote the entry on the Second Encyclopedia of the Islam, even thought that these poems could have been omitted. Some translations later on did exactly that, removed the poetry from the translations, leaving it with prose alone. A good discussion of this criticism of this approach could be found both in Heinrichs and in Van Gelder's articles on the topic. Heinrichs wrote a few articles on prosymmetric genres, including in the Nights, and Van Gelder wrote a fantastic entry on the poetry in the night in the Encyclopedia of Arabian Nights. They should be the first step of anyone interested in this topic, and I won't repeat everything that is said there. Scholars pointed to the fact that for Western audiences, since the poetry of the night was mostly non-narrative and did not contribute directly to the development of the plot, it was seen as a distraction and almost annoyance that could and perhaps should be skipped. Some even suggested that the poems were added to the original story, which for them would invalidate the place with the collection, which I think could be disproven very easily. Other readers suggested that perhaps there is some purpose in including the poetry in the collection, and that the poetry may serve several different functions. Heinrichs talked about poems taking the place of illustrations in many modern books. Poetry, like illustration, provides an opportunity to pause and reflect on a moment in the story. It seemed that Payne, who published the 1880 edition of the Nights, perceived something similar. Malcolm Lyon, the translator of the second Calcutta edition, also points to the importance of poetry in adding a musical quality, appealing to the ear and also slowing down the pace of the narrative. Both Heinrichs and Van Gelder discussed the fact that poetry in the Nights is almost completely in classical Arabic and uses classical poetic meters and rhyme. This being in spite of the fact that when this collection took shape, non-classic Arabic poetic forms already existed. It is interesting that these new forms of poetry did not find their place in the Nights. Heinrichs points to the rhetorical effect achieved when juxtaposing prose and poetry. This is even more apparent in editions like the Mahdi edition that kept the non-classical Middle Arabic language, while other editions seems to have elevated the language of the quote-unquote original. The difference between the Middle Arabic prose and the classical poetry there is even more dramatic. So as we've seen, Horvitz counted 1,250 different poems in the second Calcutta edition. Of them, he was able to identify 1/4. By identifying, I mean that he was able to find these poems in other collections, either with an attribution to a poet or in anonymity. The Knights themselves very rarely associate a poet with a name. Of course, the practice of quoting verse anonymously is prevalent in Adab, not only in the Knights. However, the small number of poets mentioned by name in the Knights is noticeable. Why anonymous? Ben Sheikh posited that it was due to the fact that everyone knows or knew these poems. Heinrichs is unconvinced, and I agree. I think that the fact that we even ask this question is mainly because of a Western tradition, almost obsession with footnotes. Footnote culture is different in pre-modern Arabic works. In a case of a work like The Knights that has many layers of stories, including from popular culture, a work that was intended for a wider readership than perhaps the typical Adab anthology, the need to attribute to a specific poet that the readers or the listeners may or may not know would just cut the flow of the stories. Let's remember the aversion of many modern readers, even some publishers, to having footnotes in books, even if they are tucked away in the bottom of a page or at the end of a text. In the Knights, there was no need to establish truthfulness or authenticity of these verses. It was a narrative. In today's presentation, I would like to share with you some of my insights on the different ways in which poetry is used in the Knights and how it interacts with prose. A few general notes before I get to the meat of what I have to say. First, I decided to work on the text of the second Calcutta edition. The reason being the expansiveness of this edition and my willingness to recognize the text added over centuries to the Night as part of the collection. However, in all of the case studies that I ended up presenting today, almost all of the poem exists also in the Mahdi edition. So it's actually old layers of the text. Second point I want to say is that my research is ongoing, and so far I only covered poetry in the first volume of the second Calcutta edition, so it will be limited in scope. For the translation of the poems, I will be relying heavily on Malcolm Lyon's translation, which I like. Occasionally I alter stuff, but mainly it's his translations. In my discussion, I will keep in mind the following questions. When is poetry used in the Night? What are the contexts in which it has appeared? How it interacts with the prose? And in what way it contributes to the story and to the general experience of the reader? So I will now share my, it's a PowerPoint. Just a second. Yes, so I will continue. I'll just organize my screen and start soon. Okay, so I will present for you 4 case studies. The first one is the story of the fisherman. The fisherman sequence is a fantastic example of a case where the inclusion of poetry adds a significant dimension to the story. Without the poetry, the story would have been very different and very lean. The plot would have remained the same, but with much of the qualities and the complexity of the story would have been lost. This is what I will try to argue here. A quick summary of the story. A hard-working fisherman casts his net at night In his multiple attempts, he fails to catch any fish. Times and again, something heavy and unhelpful is caught in the net, once even a dead donkey, which tears the net, require him to toil to repair it before he can try again. The bulk of the story focuses on his frustration, the external reaction, and inner thoughts. The prose narrative of the story reflects his outward external responses, all of which are pious, accepting God's decisions, and trusting God that God is doing the right thing. He says, "La hawla wa quwwata illa billah," and when he casts the net, he's saying, "Bismillah," everything that he should be saying. However, after each time he casts the net, he also recites a poem. The poems reflect a more nuanced, turbulent state of mind, that of his inner thoughts. In the verses, he allows himself to reveal frustrations of these misfortunes. He complains about the injustice of these circumstances, about the fact that he works so hard to provide for his family and then is rewarded with injustice. His frustrations increase from one attempt to another, as reflected in each of these poems. Let's look at some of these poems. I will read the Arabic and leave you to consult the translation. يا خائضا في ظلام الليل والهلكة اقصر عناك فليس الرزق بالحركة أما ترى البحر والصياد منتصبا لرزقه والنجوم ليل محتبكة قد خاض في وسطها والموج يلتمط وعينه لم تزل في كلكل الشبكة حتى إذا بات مسرورا بليلته بالحوت قد شق السفود والردى الحنكة ابتعاه منه من قد بات ليلته سالم من البرد في خير من البركة سبحان ربي يعطي ذا ويحرم ذا هذا يصيد وهذا يأكل السمكة. The fisherman recites the first poem after finding in his net the previously mentioned dead donkey. In the poem, he addresses the difficulty of his circumstances. The first verses mainly acknowledge that being a fisherman is a difficult profession. You work hard in the darkness of the night, yet success is not guaranteed. Even in the fortunate case in which you do catch a fish, you don't end up eating it, but rather someone else who has been sleeping comfortably in their bed, shielded from the cold and enjoying the comfort of home. But in the last verse, the fisherman pulls himself together and doesn't allow his frustration to possess him. He ends the poem by praising God. God gives and God deprives. Praise God, he says, in a near paraphrase of the biblical Job. This is how the world is. Some fish and work hard, and others eat the fish and enjoy themselves. In this poem, the fisherman begins reflecting on his situation. He is frustrated by the repeatedly unlucky casts of the net, while on the outside he recites in prose pious formulas. If he feels that the world is broken and distorted, and these thoughts are kind of creeping into his thoughts. His poem reflects his inner struggle rather than one coherent voice. Reflecting upon world order, he ends up acknowledging that order does not mean that suffering and hardship are equally distributed. Therefore, despite the difficulties that he suffered, everything really works as it should have. Thus, the feeling of injustice might have been felt for a moment, but it should not shake his belief in the divine order. He ends up with a verse restoring his belief and trust in God and in the order that he maintains. He still trusted, even if tonight it failed him. It's all a part of God's plan. And almost immediately, he continues to reciting the second poem. وإذا بليت بعسرة فالبس لها الصبر الكريم فإن ذلك أحزم لا تشكون إلى العباد فإنما تشكو الرحيم إلى الذي لا يرحم. When confronted with hardships, be patient. Sabr is the key word. Don't complain, not to fellow men anyway. Only God could be merciful. Throughout the poem, he persuades himself that rather than anger, a stoic reaction is preferable. Don't complain even if you are put in a hard spot. After another attempt of casting the net, he is once again disappointed. Having caught a jar full of sand, to retrieve it, he actually had to undress and dive into the cold water. His anger mounts, and he recites the following poem: يا حركة الدهر كفي إن لم تكفي فقفي خرجت أطلب رزقي وجدت رزقي توفي كان جاهل في الثرايا وعالم في الثرى مخفي. Stop, trouble of time. Enough. So much injustice in the world. His anger is clearly increasing, but he does not address the anger towards God. Rather, he complains to the trouble of time. The fisherman needs to repair his net. Then he addresses God, saying something like, God's, and he's talking in prose when he addresses God, asking piously for forgiveness, astaghfirullah. Then he casts his net again and catches nothing but a jug of full of junk. The narrator tells us that his anger, that he's angry. اغتاظ جدا, it says, and he cries. Then he recites the next poem. هو الرزق لا حل لديك ولا ربط ولا أدب يعطيك رزقا ولا قط ولا الحظ والأرزاق إلا مقسم فأرض بها خصب وأرض بها قحط تحط صروف الدهر كل مهذب وترفع من لا يستحق له الخط. فيا موت زور أن الحياة ذميمة إذا انحطت البازات وارتفع البط ولا عجبا إن كنت عاينت فاضلا فقيرا وذا نقص بدولته يسطو فطير يطوف الأرض شرقا ومغربا فآخر يعطي طيبات ولا يخطو. This poem expresses the peak of the frustration that he has. There is no justice in the world, and man has no agency over his life. Life is futile. In the middle of the poem, the fisherman can't take it anymore and evokes death to take him. By the way, this line, وَيَمَوْتُ زُورْ أَنَّ الْحَيَاةَ ذَمِيمَةٌ, is a quotation borrowed from Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri. Some excellent people are poor, other inferior to them rule. Some birds need to migrate great distances to get food, others have theirs brought to them. Prose expresses how he should be speaking, while poetry expresses his innermost feeling, though that he won't utter openly in prose. Verse is in a medium in which he is free to express his frustrations. The usage of both mediums allows the narrator to represent these new conflicting voices within the protagonist. After reciting the poem, the fisherman raises his head towards the sky, addresses God again, saying to him, God, you know I can only cast my net 4 times each night, and it has been already 3, and nothing came my way. God, provide me with something this time. And he utters the name of God and casts the net, nothing. He recites La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, and we move to a sub-story in that sequence. So the fisherman is experiencing an existential crisis. Alone in the night, toiling to make a living for himself, he realizes that there's no justice in the world. On the outward, he is ostensibly a modern Job, accepting everything that God is doing and uttering nothing but pious formulas, but inside he's restless. Reciting poetry gives him an outlet to utter frustration. Before I move to the subsection that concludes the story, I want to say that if we remove the poetry from this section, we would have a very different story. An unfortunate fisherman cast his net several times, and each time is disappointed. But he's always hopeful and trusts God, praise God, and eventually God helps him. That will be in the next section in some way. The poetry, though not advancing the narrative, is arguably where all of the interest in this story is. Okay, and now the story proceeds with a sub-story, if you will. The fisherman finds this very famous sequence. He finds a bottle containing an Ifrit, a jinni, who was a slave of King Solomon. The episode continues to reflect the question of justice of the world and injustice in the world. And we will see here 2 more usages of poetry. One is using poetry to address a superior. And the second is a very common one, using proverbial wisdom to support one's point. Both are key functions in the nights. Before looking at the story, I'd like to say something about the first function. Poetry is a medium to address a superior. Often we see poetry employed when a protagonist wants to address someone who is in a power position over them. A king, a jinni, a father, a husband, an owner. In such occasions, social norms require that one will address the superior with respect and avoid direct criticism. And in general, be very careful with their speech. However, it seems that while these norms are held rigidly when employing regular speech, i.e. prose, they are much more loose when the speaker uses poetry. Throughout the nights, poetry is employed as a preferred medium to address superiors, often when expressing criticism of a superior, and no less often when a person wants something from that superior, whether it's to ask for a reward or begging for one's life. Of course, poetry is not the only indirect speech employed for this purpose. Also, proverbial stories have a similar function, as we, of course, see in the night. These two functions are often combined when protagonist makes a plea to the superior and want to persuade them of something. And this is the case in The Fisherman and the Ifrit story. Okay, the plot: in his last cast of the net, the fisherman finds a bottle that contains an Ifrit, a former slave of King Solomon, no other, who was trapped in that bottle for thousands of years by Solomon himself. The fisherman realizes the Ifrit, releases the Ifrit from the bottle, ending the latter's many years of misery in extreme solitary confinement, only to discover that this ungrateful Ifrit intends to kill him. Understanding that he's about to die at the hand of this ungrateful Ifrit, there seems to be little he can do in order to save his life, but he tries. He addresses the Ifrit in verse. So let me move to, that was, our next story. Yes. فعلنا جميلا قابلونا بضده، فهذا لعمري من فعال الفواجر، ومن يفعل المعروف مع غير أهله يجازى كما جوزي مجير عامر. The fisherman is confronting the Ifrit, accusing him of acting unjustly towards him. And it is by using the verse that he could be so audacious. In this case, he is not just using the register of the verse, but also quoting a known poem. And when I'm saying known poem, let's ignore for the fact that this Ifrit was locked in a bottle for thousands of years, and thus was probably unable to keep up with the new poetry produced during this time. But yeah, a known poem. The importance is that he is bringing common wisdom to support his claim. The wisdom is a poem that relates to a story about a Bedouin who became known as Mujir Amir. As the story goes, a hyena, Amir in Arabic, fled from hunters who were pursuing her and found shelter in a cave of a Bedouin. The Bedouin considered her to be his guest, and when the hunters reached his dwelling place, he came out with his sword drawn and told them that the hyena is under his protection. He then enters the cave, goes to sleep, at which point the hyena kills him, eating his flesh and drinking his blood. This story became a proverb of ungratefulness. The story appears in many sources. For example, Ta'liq min Amali ibn Durayd and the proverb itself, many places. This poetry is proverbial, timeless wisdom that is brought in to explain the fleeting moment. Let me move now to my next case study, which is involved one of the stories in the second Darwish sequence. In it, the prince, now Darwish, falls in love with a beautiful woman who kidnapped him, who was kidnapped by a mighty Ifrit called Jirjish, and this Jirjish keeps her locked up and visits her once every some time. Georges finds out that the woman and the dervish are having an affair. He brings the two together and tortures the woman in front of her lover, seeking for a confession. I bring this story as an example of the use of poetry in expressing nonverbal language, and once again, expressing one's innermost thoughts. In the presence of Georges, the two lovers deny knowing each other. Therefore, they are unable to communicate verbally. Instead, they interpret each other's gestures. Yeah, so I have, this is not a poem, it's just a prose section that explains the situation. He's saying أشرت لها بحاجبي ودمعي يجري على وجنتي ففهمت إشارتي وغمزتني وقالت فعلت بنا كل هذا وأشرت لها إن هذا وقت العفو. Then the dervish says to himself, presumably without a voice, and that's interesting, a poem. He's reciting a poem silently that reflects upon the situation. And this is a poem. يترجم طرفي عن لساني فتعلموا ويبدي الهوى ما في ضميري أكتم ولما التقينا والدموع سواجم خرست وطرفي عنكم يتكلم تشير فأدري ما تقول بطرفها وأومي إليها بالألبان فتفهم حواجبنا تقضي الحوائج بيننا ونحن سكوت والهوى يتكلم. There are words that he wants to say, but he can't. So he expresses them with a glance instead. There's an inner world and there's an outer world. Love reveals the inner world to the outer world through physical expression and gestures. While the two lovers understand one another through their gestures, we can only understand them through the poetry, which he recites to himself silently and thus to us. Next, we have a more nonverbal communication through gaze between the two of them, silently again. And it is decoded into word. She's saying, I didn't fail you in her eyebrows. And he says, this is how you repay me, and this is how you repay me. And he understands what she's saying and signal with his eye, I will be ransomed to you with my life. Then the narrator adds, and it was as though an inner tongue, lisan halna, was saying, and we are moving to the next poem in the sequence. كم عاشق حدث بأجفانه معشوقه بالذي أضمر أوحى إليها لحظه بالعين إني علمت الذي قد جرى فما أحسن اللحظة في وجهه وما أرشق الظرف إذ عبر فهذا بأجفانه كاتب وذاك بمقلته قد قرأ. In this in-word recitation, a silent poem giving words to a dialogue that is taking place without utterances. It is all about the eye. You can write with the eye, you can recite with it, or hear with it, depends how we translate it. The glance is so full of meaning, it is almost verbal. It contains concrete messages conveyed in verse. The eyelids are like a writer who writes with a pen, and the pupil is like a reader or reciter reciting. Okay, I'm moving now to our third sequence, a case study, which is one of my favorite stories in the Nights. And it's a story of the ape scribe, still within the second dervish sequence. The poetry here is once again an integral of the story. No, it is not narrative and doesn't advance the plot. However, it is the core of the story. The verses enrich the artistic value, not only in their eloquent meaning, but also visually, in this case, combining poetry and calligraphy. The ape is, of course, not an ape, but a prince who was trapped in the shape of an ape by a spell casted on him. As a prince, he had excellent education, including training in calligraphy, but of course, the people around him know none of that. At the time of the event, the ape, being an ape, is unable to speak, and though he attracts the attention of people with his unusual intelligence and behavior, it is only through poetry that his identity is eventually revealed. The ape finds himself serving on a merchant ship that docks at a kingdom where the king's scribe just died. The king sends his men to look for a substitute scribe, and have every sailor on every ship that docks at that harbor write something. The ape takes this opportunity to show his erudition and excellent education by producing panegyric poetry, madh, in real time, and at the same time showing his mastery of 6 calligraphy styles. Each of these 6 poems is an independent poem written in a different meter and rhyme, but together they form one argument, following known patterns of madh poetry. Let me pull up. For the next slides, it's not that I found the original scroll of the ape. I just looked for examples of the different calligraphy styles. They're unrelated to the content but I just wanted to have us see the different calligraphy styles that he was looking at. So the first poem is written in Ruqai script, which is not Ruqa, by the way, it's Ruqai. And it goes like that. لقد كتب الدهر فضل الكرام وفضلكم للآن لم يكتتب ولا أيتم له منك الورى لأنك للفضل وأب. Yes, you can see the poem, right? Yeah. Yeah, okay. The ape begins with stating that time writes or records the excellence of the generous ones, meaning that the good deeds of the generous are generally remembered. However, those of His Excellency, the king, were not recorded yet. He is saying to the king, without a scribe or poet that will record your deeds, you will not be remembered. The verses imply that it is through poetry that the greatness of people is preserved. Memory equals poetry. It is a clever move that praises the patron for his greatness while implicitly establishing the patron's need of the poet. He moved to write his second poem. And once again, these are poems that are not vocalized at all. They are just written there. Then he writes 2 more verses, this time in Rihan. له قلم عم الأقاليم نفعه وعم جميع العالمين منافع فما نيل مصر مثل نائلك الذي يمد إلى الأمصار 5 أصابع. In these 2 verses, he talks about the king as someone who possesses a pen that is able to benefit all of mankind with his reach. Once again, on the surface, he's praising the king, but he is doing so in a way that lets him praise himself, since the pen that makes the king so special to mankind is nothing but his own scribe. This is a clever reference to the previous poem. Without your pen, your fame has no reach. Without a competent pen, his fame will reach, with a competent pen, your fame will reach everywhere and even benefit mankind. Of course, he is using an alliteration here of the words aqalim and qalam. The 2 words have no common roots in Arabic. Let me see if I can. These 2 words have no common roots, as aqalim, to my understanding, comes from the Greek klima, but nevertheless, in Arabic, they sound similar. He is also playing with the word Nail and Nail, the river Nile and Nail. Again, words of different origins, no common roots, but have some aesthetic value. The king is being flattered, portrayed as someone who has more reach or influence than the Nile River. Implied, of course, is that the poet, the one who makes that happen, is really the mighty river. He is a power greater than the Nile itself, which brings water and life throughout the region. But the king's reach through the scribe is actually greater than that of the Nile, because the Nile only reaches limited areas compared to the reach of the king through his scribe. And we move to our third poem in ثلث. وما من كاتب إلا سيفنى ويبقى الدهر ما كتبت يده وليتك بكفك غير شيء يسرك في القيامة إن تراه. Continuing with this metaphor of the king as scribe, the ape remind the king that we are all mortals. Every scribe will eventually perish, and what they write will last forever. The deeds of the scribe will last forever, but only if they are written. I'm sorry, the scribe. From the beginning, the boundaries between king and scribe are blurred. The king in the poem is the scribe, but also the one who needs a scribe. Thus, once again, the importance of our ape increases. The last verse in this couplet goes even farther. The king's great deeds will not only gain him the respect of mankind in this world, but actually will have a greater impact for him. It is by these recorded deeds that the king, as any human, will eventually be judged on Resurrection Day. The deeds of men that will determine their fate in the afterlife become the written deeds as recorded by the poet. And we are moving to the fourth poem, in نسخ. ولما نبين بالفراق وحكمت فينا بذاك الحوادث الأيام غدونا للأفواه المحابر تشتكي ألم الفراق بألسن الأقلام. They continue with the focus on death, implying that time when the king will eventually die. At this time, we will let the mouth of the inkwell express the pain of departure. Mouths are the inkwell, while tongues are the pens. In the fifth couplet talks about the kingship directly. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to read that. إن الخلافة لا تدوم لواحد إن كنت تنكر ذلك فأين الأول فاغرس من الفعل الجميل غرائسا فإذا عزلت فإنها لا تعزل. So this fifth couplet talks about the kingship directly. Caliphate does not last for anyone. That is, all caliphs, except for the current one. All of them are dead. Life, even that of kings, is ephemeral. But the deeds that caliphs do last. By immersing in good deeds, the caliph is involved with eternity. Like a typical panegyric poem, the external meaning is simple, simply encouraging the caliph to do good deeds, without specifying which. But the poet is leading the meaning towards his commission, his payment. The aforementioned good deeds are the payment the king should give the poet for his poem. And we move to the last poem in that sequence, in محقق. إذا فتحت دوات العز والنعم فاجعل مدادك من جود ومن كرم فاكتب بخير إذا ما كنت مقتدرا فقد نسبت بهذا النسب والقلم. The final couplet summarizes the argument. The king, the scribe, has his own inkwell, which is his greatness. He can open it up and let the ink, his generosity, flow. He can use it to do good, or shall we say, to write good. The ape finishes by saying that the king's lineage, his heritage, will be remembered through his pen by being generous. His lineage, by the way, is not his forefathers, rather his own deeds, and most important of them is his generosity to the poet. The king was amazed by the ape's calligraphy and eloquence, as we would all be, and invited him for dinner in the palaces. Then he continued to amaze everyone with his penmanships and mastery of different genres of poetry, including wine poetry. He also plays chess and doing all kind of other things. I will not discuss his poems for the sake of brevity. Let me move to our last section, the last that will be shorter than the previous ones. And these will be poems that addresses and even encourages the love of the flesh. As is well known, the Nights contains many graphic, erotic sections. These contributed greatly to its popularity among modern readership, both in the West and in the Arab world. At the same time, it has also contributed to the controversy around the Nights. The next excerpt is an example of this kind of licentious poetry. I'll take the opportunity to show its presumable effect on both pre-modern and modern audiences. The poem appears in the story of Badr ad-Din, son of the Egyptian vizier Nur ad-Din. The father Nur ad-Din and his brother Shams ad-Din parted ways in their youth after a quarrel, very strange one, over the marriage arrangement of their unborn children. Nur ad-Din ended up being born and raised in Basra, and his cousin, referred to as Sit al-Husn in Cairo. When they were united, they spent a very passionate night together. And the prose narration contains one of the most graphic sex scenes in the night. By the way, Erez Naaman wrote about this section in his articles, Taboos and Language in the 1001 Nights. I will not repeat the details, except that we are told that after having sex for 15 times during that night, no less, the exhausted lovers fell asleep eventually, embracing each other. The narrator describes the tender moment in a poem, and this poem appears in several sources outside the night. Let me pull that slide. زر من تحب ودع كلام الحاسد، ليس الحسود على الهوى بمساعد. لن يخلق الرحمن أحسن منظرا من عاشقين على فراش واحد، متعنقين عليهما حلل الرضا، متوسدين بمعسم وبساعد. وإذا تألفت القلوب مع الهوى فالناس تضرب في حديد بارد. فإذا صف لك من زمانك واحد نعم الصديق وعيش بذاك الواحد. يا من يلوم على الهوى أهل الهوى، هل يستطيع صلاح قلب واحد أو فاسد؟ The poem is not a graphic description of sex. Rather, it is focused on the beauty of love, celebrating the union of lovers, even when society disapproves. In the first couplets, the poet encourages the reader to hold on to that special person and not to heed the reproaches of the envious ones. The latter is a topos of love and erotic, in love and erotic poetry, and the enemies of love, love and lovers. In the second verse, the poet describes the two lovers in bed, saying that this sight is the most beautiful of God's creation, implying perhaps that to call these actions sinful would be wrong, or would be a sin. The third verse, depicting the blissful moment of the lovers' embrace, is followed by a statement: when hearts are joined, it is irreversible. Trying to change that is like striking on cold iron. The message of the poem is bold, but of course, such themes are prevalent in love poetry, especially in the more audacious Mujun poetry. The poem appears in a few anthologies outside the Nights. Especially noteworthy is Al-Washa's manual of Zarf culture and Muwasha and Raghib al-Isfahani Hadarat al-Udaba. Al-Washa recounts that this poem was written on the entry walls of the Majlis of Al-Ma'mun. I've written about this poet in my article, Al-Washa and the Poetics of Inscribed Objects. Inscribing a poem praising the love of the flesh at the entrance of the Majlis seems to have been a message to all who attended, that it was a place for celebration, the beauty of love, and that strict puritanical morals were not to be tolerated. In some of the sources outside the night, the poem contains an additional verse. In it, the poet wishes for someone, that the last verse that I haven't read aloud, wishes for some enjoyment before paradise, already in this world, even for one day. It is as though the poet is saying, yes, I know that in paradise there will be all kind of pleasures of the flesh, but can't we have just a little bit of fun also here on this world before? The celebration of free love, of the constraints of society, is a message that resonates in audiences beyond that of the Nights. To this day, this very poem that I just discussed was incorporated by the master Syrian singer, the Mutrib Adib al-Daykh, in a medley that came part of his repertoire. Adib al-Daykh is one of my favorite singers, a master of the Tarab style of Halab. He died in 2001. And our poem is incorporated in a medley with other love songs of similar message. I will play for you a recording, just a few minutes for a taste. I will have to unshare and share again. So excuse me if it would take for a second. No, sorry. The very beginning, there's a couplet from another song that I included. Then comes our poem.
خلقت الجمال خلقت الجمال يا رب وقلت يا عبادي اتقون فأنت رب تحب الجمال فكيف عبادك لا يعشقون فكيف عبادك لا يعشقون صل من تحب ودع كلام الحاسدين صل من تحب ودع كلام الحاسد ليس الحسود على الهوى بمساعد لم يخلق الرحمن أجمل منظرا لم يخلق الرحمن أجمل منظرا من عاشقين على فراش واحد صل من تحب صل من تحب ودع كلام الحاسدين ليس الحسود ليس الحسود على الهوى بمساعدين لم يخلق الرحمن لم يخلق الرحمن لم يخلق الرحمن لم يخلق الرحمن أجمل منظرا من عاشقين على فراش واحد
I will stop here, although the section is beautiful. Just a few words to conclude this section. I'm taking interest in this rendition for two reasons beyond the beauty of the musicianship. First, we see how much the text of the night speaks to contemporary audiences and is employed in situations beyond reading the text. And I'm assuming that Adib al-Daykh took it from the night and not from the other adab sources. Second, it is interesting to see how Adib al-Daykh is working with the poetry, which seems to correspond to the way that pre-modern singers worked with poetry. The singer chooses the verses that they want out of the entire poem, sometimes even making small changes in the words, and meddling them with other poems with similar messages. In this way, they reshape the meaning according to their understanding of the intention. I think I will stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Yaron. What a lovely evening we are having. Here it is evening, so it's at the best possible time. Thank you. So yeah, I closed the recording, which I started late, but
and I forgot to record.
I apologize, but still we will have enough to advertise it widely, please, everyone. Hopefully by tomorrow it will be out, and then yes, and then we go for the questions, comments, discussion.